Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming tonight to celebrate the paperback launch of The Story of Art Without Men. So this book came out 2 years ago, but the inception for it began, nearly 9 years ago, in October 2015. When I walked into an art fair, I looked around me and I realized that I couldn't see a single artwork by a woman artist. It was a moment that changed my life. I was stunned, and I asked myself, could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Could I name 10 pre-1950, any pre-1850? The answer was no. Had I essentially been looking at art history from a male perspective? The answer was yes. Like anyone who has had what feels like is close to an epiphany, that night I could not sleep. So I did what any millennial aspiring art historian would do, get out my phone, type the words women artists into Instagram, and nothing appeared. So I started my own. It was to be called The Great Women Artists, and I have been doing it pretty much every day since. The Instagram takes its name from the great feminist scholar Linda Nochlin, who wrote the essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists at the Dawn of the Feminist Movement in 1971. It was an essay that was published in Art News's January edition, which featured a cover of a girl looking up from her easel inside her Parisian studio, which, if you look closely, has 2 more figures through the cracked glass at the back. Have you ever wondered why this magazine featured this particular cover? In 1917, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City bought this painting for $200,000 when they thought that it was by the great neoclassical master Jacques-Louis David. It was deemed by critics as exemplary and unforgettable. By the 1930s, they had made it into prints, it was so popular. But after a while, a curator began to question its provenance. And after a few misjudgments, it was attributed to a little-known woman called Constance Charpentier, to which a male critic in 1964 responded, well, actually, there are certain weaknesses of which a painter of David's caliber would not have been guilty. In 1996, the painting was reattributed again, this time to Marie Denis Villers. Although I wonder if those historians would have paid a similar price tag or praised the work to the same degree had they known the work was by a woman. Since 2015, my Instagram account has celebrated the work of women artists from the last 1,000 years in over 2,600 posts, which I turned into a book 2 years ago, although limited myself to 500 of those years, beginning in the 1500s and ending with the present day. This book takes its name from a title I read and loved growing up, E.H. Gombrich's The Story of Art. This is what it looked like then, and this is its newly reissued version from this year, in, I might add, a surprisingly familiar color palette. While I loved this book, it wasn't until I installed a giant 10-meter-high timeline in Tate Modern, as you do, that I was brought back to it due to its timeline at the back. I was flicking through it for women's names, but I found myself turning every page again, and again, when I once more began to be stunned, realizing that he didn't include a single woman artist in his first edition, and only in his 16th edition, in my copy, did he include just one, that being the great German expressionist, Käthe Kollwitz. So, just like he left out women, I thought I'd leave out men. The thing is, I strongly believe that if we don't see art by a wide range of people, then we aren't seeing society as a whole. Different perspectives matter. By making the story of art without women, we assume the spectator as male, and the male gaze as the default gaze, which can also perpetuate gender roles in society. As John Berger famously said in his book, Ways of Seeing, men act and women appear. But they don't have to if we bring in different perspectives. Women can act too. Take Artemisia Gentileschi, the extraordinary Baroque artist working at the turn of the 1600s, who grew up in her father's workshop after her mother died when she was young. For context, women artists were extremely restricted in their educational pursuits. Sadly, they weren't the ones who could make 7-meter-high marble sculptures of David or paint entire chapels with the creation story. It took until the 1890s for them to be allowed into the life room, where they could draw the nude figure from life, an essential training for any artist. Gentileschi signed and dated her first work when she was just 17 years old. It was a towering picture based on the story of Susanna and the elders that tells the tale of the young, virtuous woman who was bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and seduce her. A popular story in art history, as it allows for the semi-naked Susanna. But this story is not pretty. It is violent and traumatic, yet so often Susanna has been pictured as an object for the male gaze, as you can see here by Guido Reni. Whereas Gentileschi, for me, gets to the realness of how vulnerable it can feel to be a woman. Gentileschi knew all too well what it felt like to be in this position. When she was 17 years old in 1611, she was raped by an artist friend of her father, which resulted in an excruciating 7-month trial where she was tortured with ropes tied around her fingers and tightened, like a modern-day lie detector, and forced to prove her innocence. While we can't read in her biography too much, she was clearly very determined to show the strength of women in her artworks, as seen here in her picture of Judith beheading Holofernes. She even changed the story to include her maidservant, who was originally keeping watch outside to help her, perhaps to show the power of what happens when women can come together. But it's true. Where do we see women being strong in art history otherwise? If we look at Caravaggio's version, he portrays Judith as weak and timid, and Holofernes as muscly, with his hand gripped on the bed as if to say he still has strength. If art becomes dominated by one narrative, not only does that become the default narrative, but it eliminates people from feeling that certain roles for them are possible. When I look at Gentileschi's work, I feel represented, but luckily I live in a time and a place when people can actually see her work. Despite being an international celebrity in her lifetime, people were so obsessed with her that they commissioned paintings of her hand. They thought it was so divine. It took until 2020 for the National Gallery in London to stage an exhibition of her work. That was their first ever exhibition dedicated to a historic female artist. For context, just 1% of the National Gallery's permanent collection is dedicated to women. But seeing this show made me see a different side of art history. If you can't see it, how can you believe it's possible? Take the great American artist Mickalene Thomas, who lives and works in New York City today, hailed for her bejeweled images of powerful women that reinterpret famous compositions from the 19th century. When Thomas was 18, she was studying to be a lawyer. But after she came across an exhibition by Carrie Mae Weems, specifically her kitchen table series from the early 1990s, which shows everyday life for a woman around her kitchen table, from the conversation she has to the gorgeous images of her doing her makeup alongside her daughter, Thomas felt represented. She'd never seen the everydayness of Black American life depicted in art, and it was this that fueled her to become an artist. As she said, "Portraits are powerful. They have great resonance in the world." If she hadn't seen Weems's work, then we wouldn't have Thomas today. We need to promote the work of art by a wide range of people to make people feel included, hopeful, and encouraged to have the strength to make that work themselves. We have been told a particular narrative of art for too long. It took the Royal Academy of Arts in London, which opened 256 years ago, 255 years to stage their first ever solo exhibition by a woman artist in their main galleries. Last year, in 2023, that being the great Marina Abramović, and there are still none in the pipeline in their programming for the coming years. We need to show everyone that they are worthy of being included in the history of art. After all, art history is the history of the world through an individual's lens, because in doing so, we'll find so many more stories and different ways of thinking about and looking at the world. While art history can't physically change the world, it can change perspectives. Look at Gillian Waring's Signs, a project that she constructed in the aftermath of the recession in the early 1990s, when she took her camera to the streets of London, along with a blank piece of paper and a pen, and asked passers-by to write down their emotions, thoughts or feelings at the exact second and hold it up so she could photograph it. Art history is about people. Art, as the poet Emily Dickinson said, is a way to tell a story, but tell it slant. So, on that note, this is the power of art history, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Pandora Sykes.
Hello.
Hello, Pandora.
I didn't get to see your beautiful presentation from behind
I'll
there.
show you afterwards.
Katy, what a pleasure it is to be speaking with you this evening. I've loved watching the incredible momentum that you've built the last few years, first with great women artists, and now, of course, the story of art without men. Before the book, there was the Instagram account and the podcast, and the account came around after you realised you could not name 20 women artists. What made you want to turn it into a book?
I think, with the Instagram, you do it every day, but it's not a kind of tangible thing. And Instagram can be so amazing for so many things, and I always think there's such a correlation between, the rise of the internet and the rise of the democratization of art. I think it's made so many more people feel included.
Yeah.
But I think with a book, books are around forever. And specifically this book is based on Gombrich's Story of Art, which, everyone in my art history class or art history degree had a copy of, and so many people have it in their living rooms or whatever. And so I think it was about creating something tangible that people can hold forever. And also I think, when I look at this book, I always feel like it's like a party with all these incredible women across history. And I love the fact that just with the art form that is the book, you can look from, the 60s to the 1860s, to the 1720s, right up until the present day, and to make those analogies the whole time. And I think, I was so sort of adamant that there should be a picture representing every single artist, much to my publisher's dismay. But it's important because I think that they need to sort of come alive, and it's exciting.
I like that you say that every household you knew had his book, because I only have your book. I don't have his book.
Let's change it.
I love that you started, your first job was on reception at an art gallery. And I always think working on reception anywhere is such an interesting portal into how people think and feel and react to the world around them. What do you think you learned from your time there that you then brought into your career as an art historian?
So I started out on front desk at a gallery called Victoria Miro, which is not far away from here. And then I worked there when I was at university, and then I worked for Damien Hirst's gallery, of all people, in my first year out of university. And, I think everyone should have that experience on working on front desk, because you meet the world and you meet so many different people who come in and they ask you questions. And the first ever exhibition I was on the front desk for was Grayson Perry's tapestries about class, and it was amazing because we're getting coachloads of people from Sunderland, people from all sort of around the UK, because he's such a kind of national treasure. And it was such a kind of, that's not usually the kind of crowd that go to these contemporary galleries, but also it was amazing to see that it also can be. I think, those commercial galleries, they're free. So many museums are free in London, and I think that's kind of also how I got into art history when I was a kid, was the fact that it was something to do on a Saturday afternoon, because you didn't have to pay for it or go into half term or, go with your mates. And I think it's so important to make sure that everyone can feel included. But, I think from sort of doing the post to all different kind of admin tasks, you get a sense of the ecosystem of the commercial art world, which I think is invaluable. And I think to have that at such a young age and to sort of see it all going on really preps you for so many different things. And also with a commercial gallery, they represent artists a bit like agents or something. So they have artists on their books and then exhibitions of those artists. And you get to understand someone's roster and their taste, and that can inform what you seek. So Victoria Miro represents people like Alice Neal, Chris Ofili, really amazing painters. And I think that was so formative in my art education, just looking and being around those works.
And you'd gone to galleries from a young age, hadn't you? You'd grown up going to... It really aged me reading you saying, I was 6 when the Tate Modern opened.
Yes. I think my sister's in the audience today. But really, it was her who introduced me to it. I was 6, she was about 15.
That's a lovely connection.
I know, but it really was. And I think when you have someone who you obviously idolize, like a sister, showing you, that this is cool, and she's going to take you to private views, and we can go to this exhibition, and we'd bring our sketchbook, and we'd look at this, and she lived in Florence, and we'd go to the Uffizi, and they were really kind of formative things. And I think, no offense to my parents, but if it's a sister, it's slightly different.
Were your parents into art as well, or was that a connection purely you had with your sister?
My sister. Sorry.
You've interviewed some epic people on your podcast. Who have been some of your favourites to interview?
So, yes, I've interviewed over 130 people now. My favourite is always the family members on artists. So for those who don't know, I have a podcast called The Great Women Artists, and I interview artists on their careers, or artist writers, or general art lovers on the female artist who means most to them. And I've interviewed sort of Tracey, Emin, Marina Abramovich, all sorts of people, literary heroes as well, like Ali Smith or Deborah Levy. But my favourite is always the family members. So I've interviewed, I think I've got some slides here, of, maybe not, Paula Rego, who was one of the most extraordinary painters. She was born in Portugal. She lived under Salazar's dictatorship as a child, and she came to the Slade in the 1950s and lived in London. And her stories, her paintings are so much about stories. And I interviewed her son, and it was such an insight into her work. And again, from his perspective, he talks about this idea that her art was a way for him to access her, because that's how he knew he could talk about her. Her paintings were also something that took him away from her, but also, he understood the world through her pictures. Or you have someone like Lee Miller, who I don't know if anyone's seen the amazing new film starring Kate Winslet, but she was this incredible photographer who was born in 1908 in Poughkeepsie, upstate New York, and she had quite a traumatic childhood. And when she was in her early 20s, she was sort of supposedly spotted on a zebra crossing by Condé Nast himself, and was on the front cover of Vogue, and sort of became this model. But she was sick of that and wanted to be behind the camera. And so she went to Paris in the 1920s, knocked on the door of Man Ray, and said, "I'm going to be your assistant." They came up with so many amazing techniques that have so often been attributed to him. And she got bored again. She went back to New York City in the 1930s to be a commercial photographer, changed her name from Elizabeth to Lee, so it was more androgynous, and actually thrived in the Great Depression. Came back to England via Egypt, became a war photographer for British Vogue. I mean, did so many things, had sort of, 12 careers in one life. In 1946, following the Second World War, gave it all up because she suffered from such bad post-PTSD, and became a celebrity chef. But what, as you do, who knows? But I think, when I interviewed her granddaughter and her son was born in 1947, and he never knew that his mother was a photographer until Amy, his daughter, was born, and her mother was looking in the attic for pictures just to compare them to see if, they looked like each other or whatever. And she went to the attic, and instead of finding baby pictures, she found 60,000 negatives, 30,000 pages of notebooks, and just like all this stuff. And he never even knew his mother was a photographer in that way. I mean, Picasso would visit on the weekends or whatever, but I think to sort of discover that and sort of see that through their eyes, and I think it's amazing because although they didn't know her as a photographer, they're the ones who have built the Lee Miller we know. They run Farley's Farm in Sussex. They've printed all those pictures. I mean, there are so many more to be discovered, but I think when you get that personal take, there's just nothing like it. Yesterday I interviewed Tove Jansson's niece. Tove Jansson created the Moomins, and her niece is Sophia, who the summer book was based on. And, I think that you just get that personable thing when you interview family members that I like.
Ali Smith's favourite book is a summer book.
Yes, I've interviewed Ali Smith too on my podcast.
Lee Miller's such an interesting one as well, isn't she? Because it's not just that she photographed the war, she took that famous picture in Hitler's bathtub, which is incredible. It's done, so is that her in?
But it's still in total.
It's not, okay. It's an amazing scene in the movie, and actually I interviewed Kate Winslet about that, and she said that she'd spent 8 years trying to make this film, with producers dropping out. She funded the whole thing for 2 weeks. She paid everyone for 2 weeks. She was absolutely desperate to get this film made. And obviously it was not a particularly sexy proposition because she wasn't really interested in Lee as like a Vogue model. She wanted to see, to take Lee to Dachau and see her taking these pictures. And it's just completely amazing because I had no idea about her. But as you say, her son is now doing so much to restore kind of this full... And she's someone that was really known by the men in her life, wasn't she?
Totally. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that, first of all, Kate Winslet, funded the crew for 2 weeks.
I know, real
and,
passion project.
I speak to so many people who make TV and documentaries, and, it's so interesting how if it was for a man or if it was focusing on a story that was sexier, even though I think it's pretty sexy to be a war photographer, but it's, it sort of breaks my heart. I speak to BBC commissioners and I say, why don't we do a documentary on Alice Neil? There's a huge show at the Barbican, we could do that. They're like, well, Alice Neil's not a headline name. And it's saying, well, you only create these headline names if you give the space to do that. And the fact that you who's so intelligent, didn't know that about Lee, how many other people don't know that story? And the kind of drive that someone like Kate Winslet had to keep going and keep pushing for this film, that deserve, I haven't seen it yet, but it deserves every, recognition, because it's a feat, and you get hardly any films made about that. I was just recording last week a documentary on Marianne Faithfull by these extraordinary filmmakers, and they were saying that if it was a documentary about Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen, people fund it like that, and it's so interesting, and I really hope the landscape is changing, because, the fact that you're all here tonight, clearly people are hungry for these stories.
They're like the forgotten stories.
Exactly, but they're so interesting.
I feel like you could find anything interesting, though, and that is what I love about your work. It's wonderful how fascinated you are by so many things. It's way better to be that way than to be not fascinated by people. Who do you long to interview? Who have you been trying and trying and trying, and one day... Or is there no one? Is there no one that you've been trying that hasn't said yes?
There is a list.
Who can you say without jeopardising?
No, it's fine. Obviously my dream would be to sort of go back in time and interview Artemisia or something, but obviously that's not possible. Someone like Nan Goldin, who is one of the most extraordinary photographers alive, and also extraordinary activists. There was a fantastic documentary. Well, first of all, she grew up in the kind of 50s and 60s in America, and very sadly her older sister committed suicide, Barbara, because she was hooked on OxyContin.
So, yes, because Nan does a lot of campaigning in the museums and things.
Exactly, Nan Goldin has actually got all these museums around the world to strip their Sackler name from their museum, which is incredible. And Nan talks about this idea that, photographing was her way of sort of talking again after her sister died. And she kind of left home, was in various sort of foster homes, sort of moved to Boston and then New York when she was, in the early 80s, and made this extraordinary body of work that, if anyone has been to Fragile Beauty at the V&A, they've got actually the whole thing, they've got sort of sections from it. It's called The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, and it's all these incredible photographs of just kind of life happening, people enjoying themselves, things going wrong, all these different things, but it's so raw, and I think everyone can see themselves in it. And it's sort of timeless, this work, and so I would love to interview her. And also just what she does with activism as well. Everyone should watch this extraordinary documentary called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed that came out last year, which was sort of running parallel to Nan's life and her photography career, was how she actually got all these museums to take down the Sackler name. And it was just done with such beauty, because it was that kind of juxtaposition between beauty and pain and blood, and these sort of temples of art being these serene places, but the people who fund them have blood on their hands. And so, for example, at the Guggenheim, which I don't know if anyone's been, but it's a kind of incredible spiral, and if you look up, it's just a spiral. And what she did, she got all these activists to sort of throw down prescription notes, and so it looked like it was snowing. Or when they were in the Sackler wing of the Met, which sort of is this sort of big glass construction, and there's a sort of really nice sort of rectangular pond, she got everyone to throw those sort of orange cylindrical prescription boxes into the water, which made it look like a constellation of stars. And it was just so breathtaking, I think. And also, her work has been so impactful. So, Nan, if you're out there, let me know. I've asked her 1,000 times. But I'd say that.
And it's amazing that she did that, but it's also really sad that, the Sackler thing was in plain sight, but it was only when Nan started to, it became an economic thing, didn't it? She wouldn't show at the galleries, and that's why they started doing something. But until her, no one really got anywhere with it.
I know, and I think it's so important for people to use their platform in whatever capacity you have. Like I always say, you know, if people ask me about like curating exhibitions or whatever, like never be precious about where you begin, and always be sort of very wise about what platform you have. Like my first ever exhibition was on like a foyer of an advertising agency. And if you have an internet connection, then, you know, use that for something exciting. I don't know. I think there are so many ways of doing it, and if you have a platform like her, you can actually, I mean, that she's up there, but she can actually change the world.
She can, and she has. We mentioned it then when we were talking about Lee, but a lot of your work, whether it's even verbalized, is uncoupling a lot of these artists from the men in their lives. And there are lots of examples in the book of when they have been famous at the time, or haven't been famous at all and have become forgotten, or have ended up being sort of surpassed or absorbed into the male artist's life. For example, Picasso. That obviously happens a lot with Picasso. Let's start with Françoise Gillot.
So Françoise Gillot was an extraordinary artist she died last year, aged 101, had an 8-decade career and left behind something like 1,600 paintings and 3,600 drawings. I mean, extraordinary. She, you know, grew up in the 1920s, Paris. She had studied law. She went to Cambridge. I mean, you know, extraordinary for like a woman at that time. She then turned to art, and she had an exhibition when she was aged 23, and she went on to be an incredible artist. Yet, when the New York Times came to write her obituary last year, they said Françoise Gillot, artist in the shadow of Picasso, is dead at 101, and an accomplished painter and memorist in her own right. She was his long lover until she did what no other mistress of his had ever done. She walked out. I mean, first of all, there's so much wrong with this headline, and I actually got the New York Times to change it to the
Did
one.
you?
Yeah, so I got them to take out in her own right and mistress. Because first of all, I think this idea that to be called an artist in her own right, oh, a speaker in her own right, well, that's saying that something's other from the default, and then you're saying the default male artist, if that makes sense, and saying that she's his mistress when they were married for 10 years, they were together for 10 years.
Yes, that's...
I mean, do I have to explain it? Anyway, so yes, I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. And could I have the next slide as well? I actually was looking at this yesterday, and it's this incredible clipping of Frida Kahlo. And I'm just going to read it. So it says, wife of the master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art. And it's insane. It says, oh wait, where is it? Oh yeah, of course he does pretty well for a little boy, but it is I who am the big artist. And it's amazing, but also it's insane to say that she gleefully dabbles, and it's just, you know, it's just typical. And I think it's, you know, and it's sort of good to sort of, you know, inject this kind of thing with humor and laugh about it. But at the same time, it's like, you know, we can't be, you know, the New York, that was, you know, probably decades ago, but the New York Times was last year, and I think we have to be so careful. It's that thing again with the platform. If you've got that platform, be really wise about it, and don't fall into the kind of clickbaity trap. And if you think, well, people won't click on it, like, assume people are more intelligent than that. And also give them an insight into this artist rather than just saying they're in the shadow of it. Because if I was to be defined by the person I was with in my 20s and I was 101, I wouldn't be too happy.
Obituaries are really important as well. Like, I'll sometimes read an obituary and it will be really obvious that the person who's wrote it really didn't have any time for the person who's died. And I feel like there should be a sort of universal obituary system where it has to go through, like, they're so incredibly biased depending on who's writing them. But they are also fascinating. I worked on an obituary section for a while when I was doing work experience, and it was, anyway, that's a story for another day. It's very interesting. And of course we must talk about Claudel and Rodin.
Yes, and we have the next slide. So Camille Claudel was one of the most extraordinary sculptors of the kind of turn of the 1900s, and she grew up in a sort of middle-class family outside of Paris. She got the family to actually move to Paris for her career. And she was sculpting marble. She was sculpting these extraordinary things. As you can see she hand-carved everything. And they were these sculptures of passion and just so emotive, and love and romance and also torture. I mean, you look at her work and you just immediately feel something. And they're just incredible. But again, she is someone who her life has been completely overshadowed by Rodin, who she was with. And, it's so interesting because, can we have the next slide? When Rodin and Claudel went to sculpt each other, first of all, Rodin never carved a marble in his life. She was the one who did that, and she was his assistant for a long time. And when they came to actually depict each other, this is her portrait of him, and this is his portrait of her. And you just think, like, the sort of, first of all, the difference in, I don't know what he's thinking.
Beautiful figure.
But I mean, this woman was
so unfair, isn't it?
but this woman was so talented, and only has it been, he sort of sent her crazy, and she went to an asylum, and she was completely abandoned by everyone in her life for the last sort of 30 years, and she died in sort of complete oblivion, and her work came to the fore in the 80s, and then it's only really been in the last few years that her work is being recognized. The Getty and the Chicago Art Institute have just had amazing shows. But where do you find her work? It's still in the Musée Rodin in Paris. And so it's so interesting. I mean, this is also kind of why I wrote this book as well, because I was so fed up of these women being seen as the wife of, the muse of, the daughter of, the sister of, and actually just to kind of just remove the men in their life and put them
she was
center
clearly a
stage.
much better artist. Are we allowed to stay stunning as that block is?